The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Preface. Footnote. I have already observed more than once that this history of the Jewish war was Josephus's first work, and published about AD 75, when he was but 38 years of age, and that when he wrote it he was not thoroughly acquainted with several circumstances of history from the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, with which it begins, till near his own times, contained in the first and former part of the second book, and so committed many involuntary errors therein, that he published his Antiquities 18 years afterward, in the 13th year of Domitian, AD 93, when he was much more completely acquainted with those ancient times, and after he had perused those most authentic histories, the first book of Maccabees, and the chronicles of the priesthood of John Hyrcanus, etc. That accordingly he then reviewed those parts of this work, and gave the public a more faithful, complete, and accurate account of the facts therein related, and honestly corrected the errors he had before run into. End of footnote. Whereas the war which the Jews made with the Romans hath been the greatest of all those, not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those that ever were heard of, both of those wherein cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations, while some men who were not concerned in the affairs themselves have gotten together vain and contradictory stories by hearsay, and have written them down after a sophistical manner, and while those that were there present have given false accounts of things, and this either out of a humour of flattery to the Romans, or of hatred towards the Jews, and while their writings contain sometimes accusations, and sometimes encomiums, but nowhere the accurate truth of the facts, I have proposed to myself, for the sake of such as live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our country, and sent to the upper barbarians. Footnote. Who these upper barbarians, remote from the sea, were, Josephus himself will inform us in section 2, namely the Parthians and Babylonians, and remotest Arabians of the Jews among them, besides the Jews beyond Euphrates, and the Adiabeni or Assyrians. Whence we also learn that these Parthians, Babylonians, the remotest Arabians, or at least the Jews among them, as also the Jews beyond Euphrates and the Adiabeni or Assyrians, understood Josephus's Hebrew, or rather Chaldaic books of the Jewish war, before they were put into the Greek language. End of footnote. Joseph, the son of Matthias, by birth a Hebrew, a priest also, and one who at first fought against the Romans myself, and was forced to be present at what was done afterwards, am the author of this work. Now at the time when this great concussion of affairs happened, the affairs of the Romans were themselves in great disorder. Those Jews also who were for innovations then arose when the times were disturbed. They were also in a flourishing condition for strength and riches, insomuch that the affairs of the East were then exceeding tumultuous, while some hoped for gain, and others were afraid of loss in such troubles. For the Jews hoped that all of their nation which were beyond Euphrates would have raised an insurrection together with them. The Gauls also, in the neighbourhood of the Romans, were in motion, and the Geltin were not quiet, but all was in disorder after the death of Nero. And the opportunity now offered induced many to aim at the royal power, and the soldiery affected change out of the hopes of getting money. I thought it therefore an absurd thing to see the truth falsified in affairs of such great consequence, and to take no notice of it, but to suffer those Greeks and Romans that were not in the wars to be ignorant of these things, and to read either flatteries or fictions, while the Parthians and the Babylonians, and the remotest Arabians, and those of our nation beyond Euphrates, with the Adiabeni, by my means knew accurately both whence the war begun, what miseries it brought upon us, and after what manner it ended. It is true, these writers have the confidence to call their accounts histories, wherein yet they seem to me to fail of their own purpose, as well as to relate nothing that is sound. For they have a mind to demonstrate the greatness of the Romans, while they still diminish and lessen the actions of the Jews, as not discerning how it cannot be that those must appear to be great who have only conquered those that were little. Nor are they ashamed to overlook the length of the war, the multitude of the Roman forces who so greatly suffered in it, or the might of the commanders, whose great labours about Jerusalem will be deemed inglorious, if what they achieved be reckoned but a small matter. However, I will not go to the other extreme, out of opposition to those men who extol the Romans, nor will I determine to raise the actions of my countrymen too high, but I will prosecute the actions of both parties with accuracy. Yet shall I suit my language to the passions I am under, as to the affairs I describe, and must be allowed to indulge some lamentations upon the miseries undergone by my own country. For that it was a seditious temper of our own that destroyed it, and that they were the tyrants among the Jews who brought the Roman power upon us, who unwillingly attacked us and occasioned the burning of our holy temple, Titus Caesar, who destroyed it, is himself a witness, who during the entire war pitied the people who were kept under by the seditious, and did often voluntarily delay the taking of the city, and allowed time to the siege, in order to let the authors have opportunity for repentance. But if any one makes an unjust accusation against us, when we speak so passionately about the tyrants, or the robbers, or sorely bewail the misfortunes of our country, let him indulge my affections herein, though it be contrary to the rules for writing history, because it had so come to pass that our city Jerusalem had arrived at a higher degree of felicity than any other city under the Roman government, and yet at last fell into the sorest of calamities again. Accordingly, it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, footnote, that these calamities of the Jews, who were our Saviour's murderers, were to be the greatest that had ever been since the beginning of the world, our Saviour had directly foretold. Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, Mark chapter 13, verse 19, Luke chapter 21, verses 23 and 24. And that they proved to be such accordingly, Josephus is here a most authentic witness. End of footnote. Are not so considerable as they were, while the authors of them were not foreigners neither. This makes it impossible for me to contain my lamentations, but if any one be inflexible in his censures of me, let him attribute the facts themselves to the historical part, and the lamentations to the writer himself only. However, I may justly blame the learned men among the Greeks, who, when such great actions have been done in their own times, which, upon the comparison, quite eclipse the old wars, do yet sit as judges of those affairs, and pass bitter censures upon the labours of the best writers of antiquity. Which moderns, although they may be superior to the old writers in eloquence, yet are they inferior to them in the execution of what they intended to do. while these also write new histories about the Assyrians and Medes, as if the ancient writers had not described their affairs as they ought to have done, although these be as far inferior to them in abilities as they are different in their notions from them. For of old every one took upon them to write what happened in his own time, where their immediate concern in the actions made their promises of value, and where it must be reproachful to write lies, when they must be known by the readers to be such. But then an undertaking to preserve the memory of what hath not been before recorded, and to represent the affairs of one's own time to those that come afterwards, is really worthy of praise and commendation. Now he is to be esteemed to have taken good pains in earnest, not who does no more than change the disposition and order of other men's works, but he who not only relates what had not been related before, but composes an entire body of history of his own. Accordingly I have been at great charges, and have taken very great pains about this history, though I be a foreigner, and do dedicate this work as a memorial of great actions both to the Greeks and to the barbarians. But for some of our own principal men, their mouths are wide open, and their tongues loosed presently, for gain and lawsuits, but quite muzzled up when they are to write history, where they must speak truth, and gather facts together with a great deal of pains. And so they leave the writing such histories to weaker people, and to such as are not acquainted with the actions of princes. Yet shall the real truth of historical facts be preferred by us, how much soever it be neglected among the Greek historians. To write concerning the antiquities of the Jews, who they were originally, and how they revolted from the Egyptians, and what country they travelled over, and what countries they seized upon afterward, and how they were removed out of them, I think this not to be a fit opportunity, and on other accounts also superfluous. And this because many Jews before me have composed the histories of our ancestors very exactly, as have some of the Greeks done it also, and have translated our histories into their own tongue, and have not much mistaken the truth in their histories. But then, where the writers of these affairs and our prophets leave off, thence shall I take my rise, and begin my history. Now as to what concerns that war which happened in my own time, I will go over it very largely, and with all the diligence I am able. But for what preceded mine own age, that I shall run over briefly. For example, I shall relate how Antiochus, who was named Epiphanes, took Jerusalem by force, and held it 3 years and 3 months, and was then ejected out of the country by the sons of Asamoneus. After that, how their posterity quarrelled about the government, and brought upon their settlement the Romans and Pompey. How Herod also, the son of Antipater, dissolved their government, and brought Sosius upon them. As also how our people made a sedition upon Herod's death, while Augustus was the Roman emperor, and Quintilius Varus was in that country, and how the war broke out in the 12th year of Nero, with what happened to Cestius, and what places the Jews assaulted in a hostile manner in the first sallies of the war. As also I shall relate how they built walls about the neighbouring cities, and how Nero, upon Cestius's defeat, was in fear of the entire event of the war, and thereupon made Vespasian general in this war, and how this Vespasian, with the elder of his sons, Titus, made an expedition into the country of Judea, what was the number of the Roman army that he made use of, and how many of his auxiliaries were cut off in all Galilee, and how he took some of its cities entirely and by force, and others of them by treaty and on terms. Now, when I am come so far, I shall describe the good order of the Romans in war, and the discipline of their legions, the amplitude of both the Galilees, with its nature and the limits of Judea. And besides this, I shall particularly go over what is peculiar to the country, the lakes and fountains that are in them, and what miseries happened to every city as they were taken, and all this with accuracy, as I saw the things done, or suffered in them. For I shall not conceal any of the calamities I myself endured, since I shall relate them to such as know the truth of them. After this I shall relate how, when the Jews' affairs were become very bad, Nero died, and Vespasian, when he was going to attack Jerusalem, was called back to take the government upon him, what signs happened to him relating to his gaining that government, and what mutations of government then happened at Rome, and how he was unwillingly made emperor by his soldiers, and how, upon his departure to Egypt to take upon him the government of the empire, the affairs of the Jews became very tumultuous, as also how the tyrants rose up against them, and fell into dissensions among themselves. Moreover, I shall relate how Titus marched out of Egypt into Judea the second time, as also how and where and how many forces he got together, and in what state the city was, by the means of the seditious, at his coming, what attacks he made, and how many ramparts he cast up, of the 3 walls that encompass the city, and of their measures, of the strength of the city, and the structure of the temple and holy house, and besides the measures of those edifices and of the altar, and all accurately determined. A description also of certain of their festivals, and 7 purifications of purity. Footnote: these 7, or rather 5, degrees of purity or purification are enumerated hereafter. The rabbins make 10 degrees of them, as Rieland there informs us. End of footnote. And the sacred ministrations of the priests, with the garments of the priests and of the high priests, and of the nature of the most holy place of the temple, without concealing anything or adding anything to the known truth of things. After this I shall relate the barbarity of the tyrants towards the people of their own nation, as well as the indulgence of the Romans in sparing foreigners, and how often Titus, out of his desire to preserve the city and the temple, invited the seditious to come to terms of accommodation. I shall also distinguish the sufferings of the people and their calamities, how far they were afflicted by the sedition, and how far by the famine, and at length were taken. Nor shall I omit to mention the misfortunes of the deserters, nor the punishments inflicted on the captives, as also how the temple was burnt against the consent of Caesar, and how many sacred things that had been laid up in the temple were snatched out of the fire, the destruction also of the entire city, with the signs and wonders that went before it, and the taking the tyrants captives, and the multitude of those that were made slaves, and into what different misfortunes they were every one distributed. Moreover, what the Romans did to the remains of the wall, and how they demolished the strongholds that were in the country, and how Titus went over the whole country, and settled its affairs, together with his return into Italy and his triumph. I have comprehended all these things in 7 books, and have left no occasion for complaint or accusation to such as have been acquainted with this war. And I have written it down for the sake of those that love truth, but not for those that please themselves with fictitious relations. And I will begin my account of these things with what I call my first chapter. End of preface. Recording by Graham Redman.
Book 1, Chapters 1 and 2 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, Chapters 1 and 2. Containing the interval of 167 years, from the taking of Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes to the death of Herod the Great. Chapter 1. How the city Jerusalem was taken, and the temple pillaged by Antiochus Epiphanes, as also concerning the actions of the Maccabees, Matthias and Judas, and concerning the death of Judas. At the same time that Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, had a quarrel with the sixth Ptolemy about his right to the whole country of Syria, a great sedition fell among the men of power in Judea, and they had a contention about obtaining the government, while each of those that were of dignity could not endure to be subject to their equals. However, Onias, one of the high priests, got the better, and cast the sons of Tobias out of the city, who fled to Antiochus, and besought him to make use of them for his leaders, and to make an expedition into Judea. The king being thereto disposed beforehand, complied with them, and came upon the Jews with a great army, and took their city by force, and slew a great multitude of those that favored Ptolemy, and sent out his soldiers to plunder them without mercy. He also spoiled the temple, and put a stop to the constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice of expiation for 3 years and 6 months. But Onias, the high priest, fled to Ptolemy, and received a place from him in the Nomus of Heliopolis, where he built a city resembling Jerusalem, and a temple that was like its temple, concerning which we shall speak more in its proper place hereafter. Footnote: I see little difference in the several accounts in Josephus about the Egyptian temple Onion, of which large complaints are made by his commentators. Onias, it seems, hoped to have made it very like that at Jerusalem, and of the same dimensions, and so he appears to have really done, as far as he was able and thought proper. Of this temple, see Antiquities, B. 13, Chapter 3, Sections 1 through 3, and Of the War, B. 7, Chapter 10, Section 8. End footnote. 2. Now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking the city, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there, but being overcome with his violent passions, and remembering what he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country, and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death. Bacchides also, who was sent to keep the fortresses, having these wicked commands, joined to his own natural barbarity, indulged all sorts of the extremest wickedness, and tormented the worthiest of the inhabitants, man by man, and threatened their city every day with open destruction, till at length he provoked the poor sufferers by the extremity of his wicked doings to avenge themselves. 3. Accordingly Matthias, the son of Asamoneus, one of the priests who lived in a village called Modin, armed himself, together with his own family, which had 5 sons of his in it, and slew Bacchides with daggers. And thereupon, out of the fear of the many garrisons of the enemy, he fled to the mountains, and so many of the people followed him that he was encouraged to come down from the mountains, and to give battle to Antiochus's generals, when he beat them and drove them out of Judea. So he came to the government by this his success, and became the prince of his own people by their own free consent, and then died, leaving the government to Judas, his eldest son. 4. Now Judas, supposing that Antiochus would not lie still, gathered an army out of his own countrymen, and was the first that made a league of friendship with the Romans, and drove Epiphanes out of the country when he had made a second expedition into it, and this by giving him a great defeat there. And when he was warmed by this great success, he made an assault upon the garrison that was in the city, for it had not been cut off hitherto. So he ejected them out of the upper city, and drove the soldiers into the lower, which part of the city was called the citadel. He then got the temple under his power, and cleansed the whole place, and walled it round about, and made new vessels for sacred ministrations, and brought them into the temple, because the former vessels had been profaned. He also built another altar, and began to offer the sacrifices. And when the city had already received its sacred constitution again, Antiochus died, whose son Antiochus succeeded him in the kingdom, and in his hatred to the Jews also. 5. So this Antiochus got together 50,000 footmen, and 5,000 horsemen, and 80 elephants, and marched through Judea into the mountainous parts. He then took Bethsura, which was a small city, but at a place called Bethzacharus, where the passage was narrow, Judas met him with his army. However, before the forces joined battle, Judas's brother Eleazar, seeing the very highest of the elephants adorned with a large tower, and with military trappings of gold to guard him, and supposing that Antiochus himself was upon him, he ran a great way before his own army, and cutting his way through the enemy's troops, he got up to the elephant, yet he could not reach him who seemed to be the king, by reason of his being so high, but still he ran his weapon into the belly of the beast, and brought him down upon himself, and was crushed to death, having done no more than attempted great things, and showed that he preferred glory before life. Now he that governed the elephant was but a private man, and had he proved to be Antiochus, Eleazar had performed nothing more by this bold stroke than that it might appear he chose to die when he had the bare hope of thereby doing a glorious action. Nay, this disappointment proved an omen to his brother Judas how the entire battle would end. It is true that the Jews fought it out bravely for a long time, but the king's forces, being superior in number, and having fortune on their side, obtained the victory. And when a great many of his men were slain, Judas took the rest with him, and fled to the toparchy of Gopna. So Antiochus went to Jerusalem, and stayed there but a few days, for he wanted provisions, and so he went his way. He left indeed a garrison behind him, such as he thought sufficient to keep the place, but drew the rest of his army off, to take their winter quarters in Syria. 6. Now, after the king was departed, Judas was not idle, for as many of his own nation came to him, so did he gather those that had escaped out of the battle together, and gave battle again to Antiochus's generals at a village called Adassa. And being too hard for his enemies in the battle, and killing a great number of them, he was at last himself slain also. Nor was it many days afterward that his brother John had a plot laid against him by Antiochus's party, and was slain by them. Chapter 2. Concerning the successors of Judas, who were Jonathan and Simon, and John Hyrcanus. 1. When Jonathan, who was Judas's brother, succeeded him, he behaved himself with great circumspection in other respects, with relation to his own people, and he corroborated his authority by preserving his friendship with the Romans. He also made a league with Antiochus the son. Yet was not all this sufficient for his security, for the tyrant Trypho, who was guardian to Antiochus's son, laid a plot against him, and besides that endeavored to take off his friends, and caught Jonathan by a while, as he was going to Ptolemais to Antiochus, with a few persons in his company, and put him in bonds, and then made an expedition against the Jews. But when he was afterward driven away by Simon, who was Jonathan's brother, and was enraged at his defeat, he put Jonathan to death. 2. However, Simon managed the public affairs after a courageous manner, and took Gazara, and Joppa, and Jamnia, which were cities in his neighborhood. He also got the garrison under, and demolished the citadel. He was afterward an auxiliary to Antiochus, against Trypho, whom he besieged in Dora before he went on his expedition against the Medes. Yet could not he make the king ashamed of his ambition, though he had assisted him in killing Trypho, for it was not long ere Antiochus sent Cendebeus, his general, with an army to lay waste to Judea, and to subdue Simon. Yet he, though he was now in years, conducted the war as if he were a much younger man. He also sent his sons with a band of strong men against Antiochus, while he took part of the army himself with him, and fell upon him from another quarter. He also laid a great many men in ambush in many places of the mountains, and was superior in all his attacks upon them. And when he had been conqueror after so glorious a manner, he was made high priest, and also freed the Jews from the dominion of the Macedonians, after 170 years of the empire of Seleucus. 3. This Simon also had a plot laid against him, and was slain at a feast by his son-in-law Ptolemy, who put his wife and 2 sons into prison, and sent some persons to kill John, who is also called Hyrcanus. Footnote: Why this John, the son of Simon, the high priest and governor of the Jews, was called Hyrcanus, Josephus nowhere informs us, nor is he called other than John at the end of the first book of the Maccabees. However, Sixtus Suensis, when he gives us an epitome of the Greek version of the book here abridged by Josephus, or of the chronicles of this John Hyrcanus, then extant, assures us that he was called Hyrcanus from his conquest of one of that time. See Athent Rec. Part 1, page 207. But of this younger Antiochus, see Dean Aldrich's note here. End footnote. But when the young man was informed of their coming beforehand, he made haste to get to the city, as having a very great confidence in the people there, both on account of the memory of the glorious actions of his father, and of the hatred they could not but bear to the injustice of Ptolemy. Ptolemy also made an attempt to get into the city by another gate, but was repelled by the people, who had just then admitted of Hyrcanus. So he retired presently to one of the fortresses that were about Jericho, which was called Dagon. Now when Hyrcanus had received the high priesthood, which his father had held before, and had offered sacrifices to God, he made great haste to attack Ptolemy, that he might afford relief to his mother and brethren. 4. So he laid siege to the fortress, and was superior to Ptolemy in other respects, but was overcome by him as to the just affection he had for his relations. For when Ptolemy was distressed, he brought forth his mother and his brethren, and set them upon the wall, and beat them with rods in everybody's sight, and threatened that unless he would go away immediately, he would throw them down headlong, at which sight Hyrcanus's commiseration and concern were too hard for his anger. But his mother was not dismayed, neither at the stripes she received, nor at the death with which she was threatened, but stretched out her hands, and prayed her son not to be moved with the injuries that she suffered to spare the wretch, since it was to her better to die by the means of Ptolemy, than to live ever so long, provided he might be punished for the injuries he done to their family. Now John's case was this: when he considered the courage of his mother, and heard her entreaty, he set about his attacks, but when he saw her beaten, and torn to pieces with the stripes, he grew feeble, and was entirely overcome by his affections. And as the siege was delayed by this means, the year of rest came on, upon which the Jews rest every 7th year, as they do on every 7th day. On this year, therefore, Ptolemy was freed from being besieged, and slew the brethren of John, with their mother, and fled to Zeno, which was also called Cotylas, who is the tyrant of Philadelphia. 5. And now Antiochus was so angry at what he had suffered from Simon, that he made an expedition into Judea, and sat down before Jerusalem, and besieged Hyrcanus. But Hyrcanus opened the sepulchre of David, who was the richest of all kings, and took thence about 3,000 talents in money, and induced Antiochus, by the promise of 3,000 talents, to raise the siege. Moreover, he was the first of the Jews that had money enough, and began to hire foreign auxiliaries also. 6. However, at another time, when Antiochus was gone upon an expedition against the Medes, and so gave Hyrcanus an opportunity of being revenged upon him, he immediately made an attack upon the cities of Syria, as thinking, what proved to be the case with them, that he should find them empty of God troops. So he took Medaba and Samia, with the towns in their neighborhood, as also Shechem and Gerizim. And besides these he subdued the nation of the Cuthians, who dwelt round about that temple which was built in imitation of the temple at Jerusalem. He also took a great many other cities of Idumea, with Adorion and Marissa. 7. He also proceeded as far as Samaria, where is now the city Sebast, which was built by Herod the king, and encompassed it all round with a wall, and set his sons, Aristobulus and Antigonus, over the siege, who pushed it on so hard that a famine so far prevailed within the city that they were forced to eat what never was esteemed food. They also invited Antiochus, who was called Cyzicenus, to come to their assistance, whereupon he got ready, and complied with their invitation, but was beaten by Aristobulus and Antigonus, and fled away from them. So they returned back to Samaria, and shut the multitude again within the wall. And when they had taken the city, they demolished it, and made slaves of its inhabitants. And as they had still great success in their undertakings, they did not suffer their zeal to cool, but marched with an army as far as Scythopolis, and made an incursion upon it, and laid waste all the country that lay within Mount Carmel. 8. But then these successes of John and of his sons made them be envied, and occasioned a sedition in the country. And many there were who got together, and would not be at rest till they brake out into open war, in which war they were beaten. So John lived the rest of his life very happily, and administered the government after a most extraordinary manner, and this for 33 entire years together. He died, leaving 5 sons behind him. He was certainly a very happy man, and afforded no occasion to have any complaint made of fortune on his account. He it was who alone had 3 of the most desirable things in the world, the government of his nation, and the high priesthood, and the gift of prophecy. For the deity conversed with him, and he was not ignorant of any thing that was to come afterward, insomuch that he foresaw and foretold that his 2 eldest sons would not continue masters of the government. And it will highly deserve our narration to describe their catastrophe, and how far inferior these men were to their father in felicity. End of Book 1, Chapters 1 and 2. Book 1, Chapters 3 and 4 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews, by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3. How Aristobulus was the first that put a diadem about his head, and after he had put his mother and brother to death, died himself, when he had reigned no more than a year. 1. For after the death of their father, the elder of them, Aristobulus, changed the government into a kingdom, and was the first that put a diadem upon his head, 471 years and 3 months after our people came down into this country, when they were set free from the Babylonian slavery. Now, of his brethren, he appeared to have an affection for Antigonus, who was next to him, and made him his equal. But for the rest he bound them, and put them in prison. He also put his mother in bonds, for her contesting the government with him, for John had left her to be the governess of public affairs. He also proceeded to that degree of barbarity as to cause her to be pined to death in prison. 2. But vengeance circumvented him in the affair of his brother Antigonus, whom he loved, and whom he made his partner in the kingdom. For he slew him by the means of the calumnies which ill men about the palace contrived against him. At first, indeed, Aristobulus would not believe their reports, partly out of the affection he had for his brother, and partly because he thought that a great part of these tales were owing to the envy of their relators. However, as Antigonus came once in a splendid manner from the army to that festival, wherein our ancient custom is to make tabernacles for God, it happened, in those days, that Aristobulus was sick, and that, at the conclusion of the feast, Antigonus came up to it, with his armed men about him, and this when he was adorned in the finest manner possible, and that, in a great measure, to pray to God on the behalf of his brother. Now at this very time it was that these ill men came to the king, and told him in what a pompous manner the armed men came, and with what insolence Antigonus marched, and that such his insolence was too great for a private person, and that accordingly he was come with a great band of men to kill him, for what he could not endure this bare enjoyment of royal honor, when it was in his power to take the kingdom himself. 3. Now Aristobulus, by degrees, and unwillingly, gave credit to these accusations, and accordingly he took care not to discover his suspicion openly, though he provided to be secure against any accidents. So he placed the guards of his body in a certain dark subterranean passage, for he lay sick in a place called formerly the Citadel, though afterwards its name was changed to Antonia. And he gave orders that if Antigonus came unarmed, they should let him alone, but if he came to him in his armor, they should kill him. He also sent home to let him know beforehand that he should come unarmed. But, upon this occasion, The queen very cunningly contrived the matter with those that plotted his ruin, for she persuaded those that were sent to conceal the king's message, but to tell Antigonus how his brother had heard he had got the suit of armor made with fine martial ornaments in Galilee, and because his present sickness hindered him from coming and seeing all that finery, he very much desired to see him now in his armor, because, said he, in a little time thou art going away from me. 4. As soon as Antigonus heard this, the good temper of his brother not allowing him to suspect any harm from him, he came along with his armor on to show it to his brother. But when he was going along that dark passage, which was called Strato's Tower, he was slain by the bodyguards, and became an eminent instance how calumny destroys all good will and natural affection, and how none of our good affections are strong enough to resist envy perpetually. 5. And truly any one would be surprised at Judas upon this occasion. He was of the sect of the Essenes, and had never failed or deceived men in his predictions before. Now this man saw Antigonus as he was passing along by the temple, and cried out to his acquaintance, they were not a few who attended upon him as his scholars, O strange, said he, it is good for me to die now, since truth is dead before me, and somewhat that I have foretold hath proved false. For this Antigonus is this day alive, who ought to have died this day, and the place where he ought to be slain, according to that fatal decree, was Strato's Tower, which is at the distance of 600 furlongs from this place. And yet 4 hours of this day are over already, which point of time renders the prediction impossible to be filled. And when the old man had said this, he was dejected in his mind, and so continued. But in a little time news came that Antigonus was slain in a subterraneous passage, which was itself also called Strato's Tower, by the same name with that Caesarea which lay by the seaside, and this ambiguity it was which caused the prophet's disorder. 6. Hereupon Aristobulus repented of the great crime he had been guilty of, and this gave occasion to the increase of his distemper. He also grew worse and worse, and his soul was constantly disturbed at the thoughts of what he had done, till his very bowels being torn to pieces by the intolerable grief he was under, so threw up a great quantity of blood. And as one of those servants that attended him carried out that blood, he, by some supernatural providence, slipped and fell down in the very place where Antigonus had been slain, and so he spilt some of the murderer's blood upon the spots of the blood had been murdered, which still appeared. Hereupon a lamentable cry arose among the spectators, as if the servant had spilled the blood on purpose in that place, and as the king heard that cry, he inquired what was the cause of it, and while nobody durst tell him, he pressed them so much the more to let him know what was the matter. So at length, when he had threatened them, and forced them to speak out, they told. Whereupon he burst into tears, and groaned, and said, So I perceive I am not like to escape the all-seeing eye of God, as to the great crimes I have committed, but the vengeance of the blood of my kinsmen pursues me hastily. O thou most impudent body, how long wilt thou retain a soul that ought to die on account of the punishment it ought to suffer for a mother and a brother slain? How long shall I myself spend my blood drop by drop? Let them take it all at once, and let their ghosts no longer be disappointed by a few parcels of my bowels offered to them. As soon as he had said these words, he presently died, when he had reigned no longer than a year. Chapter 4. What actions were done by Alexander Jannaeus, who reigned 27 years. 1. And now the king's wife loosed the king's brethren, and made Alexander king, who appeared both elder in age, and more moderate in his temper than the rest, who, when he came to the government, slew one of his brethren, as affecting to govern himself, but had the other of them in great esteem, as loving a quiet life, without meddling with public affairs. 2. Now it happened that there was a battle between him and Ptolemy, who is called Lathyrus, who had taken the city Asochus. He indeed slew a great many of his enemies, but the victory rather inclined to Ptolemy. But when this Ptolemy was pursued by his mother Cleopatra, and retired into Egypt, Alexander besieged Gadara, and took it. He also did Amathus, which was the strongest of all the fortresses that were about Jordan. And therein were the most precious of all the possessions of Theodorus, the son of Zeno. Whereupon Theodopus marched against him, and took what belonged to himself, as well as the king's baggage, and slew 10,000 of the Jews. However, Alexander recovered this blow, and turned his force towards the maritime parts, and took Raphia and Gaza, with Anthedon also, which was afterwards called Agrippius by King Herod. 3. But when he had made slaves of the citizens of all these cities, the nation of the Jews made an insurrection against him at a festival. For at those feasts seditions are generally begun, and it looked as if he should not be able to escape the plot they had laid for him, and not his foreign auxiliaries, the Pisidians and Cilicians, assisted him. For as to the Syrians, he never admitted them among his mercenary troops, on account of their innate enmity against the Jewish nation. And when he had slain more than 6,000 of the rebels, he made an incursion into Arabia. And when he had taken that country, together with the Gileadaries and Moabites, he enjoined them to pay him tribute, and returned to Areathus. And as Theodorus was surprised at his great success, he took the fortress, and demolished it. 4. However, when he fought with Obodas, king of the Arabians, who had lain in ambush for him near Golan, and a plot against him, he lost his entire army, which was crowded together in a deep valley, and broken to pieces by the multitude of camels. And when he had made his escape to Jerusalem, he provoked the multitude, which hated him before, to make an insurrection against him, and this on account of the greatness of the calamity that he was under. However, he was then too hard for them, and, in the several battles that were fought on both sides, he slew not fewer than 50,000 of the Jews in the interval of 6 years. Yet he had no reason to rejoice in these victories, since he did but consume his own kingdom, till at length he left off fighting, and endeavored to come to a composition with them, by talking with his subjects. But this mutability and irregularity of his conduct made them hate him still more. And when he asked them why they so hated him, and what he should do in order to appease them, they said, by killing himself. For that it would be then all they could do to be reconciled to him, who had done such tragical things to them, even when he was dead. At the same time they invited Demetrius, who was called Eucerus, to assist them. And as he readily complied with their requests, in hopes of great advantages, and came with his army, the Jews joined with those auxiliaries about Shechem. Yet did Alexander meet both these forces with 1,000 horsemen, and 8,000 mercenaries that were on foot. He also had with him that part of the Jews which favored him, to the number of 10,000, while the adverse party had 3,000 horsemen, and 14,000 footmen. Now, before they joined battle, the kings made proclamation, and endeavored to draw off each other's soldiers, and make them revolt. While Demetrius hoped to induce Alexander's mercenaries to leave him, and Alexander hoped to induce the Jews that were with Demetrius to leave him. But since neither the Jews would leave off their rage, nor the Greeks prove unfaithful, they came to an engagement, and to a close fight with their weapons, in which battle Demetrius was the conqueror, although Alexander's mercenaries showed the greatest exploits, both in soul and body. Yet did the upshot of this battle prove different from what was expected, as to both of them, for neither did those that invited Demetrius to come to them continue firm to him, though he was conqueror, and 6,000 Jews, out of pity to the change of Alexander's condition, when he was fled to the mountains, came over to him. Yet could not Demetrius bear this turn of affairs, but supposing that Alexander was already become a match for him again, and that all the nation would at length run to him, he left the country, and went his way. However, the rest of the Jewish multitude did not lay aside their quarrels with him, when the foreign auxiliaries were gone, but they had a perpetual war with Alexander, until he had slain the greatest part of them, and driven the rest into the city Bernasilis. And when he had demolished that city, he carried the captives to Jerusalem. Nay, his rage was grown so extravagant, that his barbarity proceeded to the degree of impiety. For when he had ordered 800 to be hung upon crosses in the midst of the city, he had the throats of their wives and children cut before their eyes, and these executions he saw as he was drinking and lying down with his concubines, upon which so deep a surprise seized on the people, that 8,000 of his opposers fled away the very next night out of all Judea, whose flight was only terminated by Alexander's death. So at last, though not till late, and with great difficulty, he, by such actions, procured quiet to his kingdom, and left off fighting any more. 7. Yet did that Antiochus, who is also called Dionysius, became an origin of troubles again. This man was the brother of Demetrius, and the last of the race of the Seleucidae. Footnote: Josephus here calls this Antiochus the last of the Seleucidae, although there remained still a shadow of another king of that family, Antiochus Asiaticus, or Commaginus, who reigned, or rather lay hid, till Pompey quite turned him out, as Dean Altridge here notes from Appian and Justin. End footnote. Alexander was afraid of him when he was marching against the Arabians, so he cut a deep trench between Antipatris, which was near the mountains, and the shores of Joppa. He also erected a high wall before the trench, and built wooden towers, in order to hinder any sudden approaches. But still he was not able to exclude Antiochus, for he burnt the towers, and filled up the trenches, and marched on with his army. And as he looked upon taking his revenge on Alexander, for endeavoring to stop him, as a thing of less consequence, he marched directly against the Arabians, whose king retired into such parts of the country as were fittest for engaging the enemy, and then on the sudden made his horse turn back, which were in number 10,000, and fell upon Antiochus's army while they were in disorder, and a terrible battle ensued. Antiochus's troops, so long as he was alive, fought it out, although a mighty slaughter was made among them by the Arabians. But when he fell, for he was in the forefront, in the utmost danger, in rallying his troops, they all gave ground, and the greatest part of his army were destroyed, either in the action or the flight. And for the rest, who fled to the village of Cana, it happened that they were all consumed by want of necessaries, a few only excepted. 8. About this time it was that the people of Damascus, out of their hatred to Ptolemy, the son of Menhens, invited Aretas to take the government, and made him king of Celesyria. This man also made an expedition against Judea, and beat Alexander in battle, but afterwards retired by mutual agreement. But Alexander, when he had taken Pella, marched to Gerasa again, out of his covetous desire he had of Theodorus's possessions. And when he had built a triple wall about the garrison, he took the place by force. He also demolished Golan, and Seleucia, and what was called the Valley of Antiochus. Besides which, he took the strong fortress of Gamala, and stripped Demetrius, who was governor therein, of what he had, on account of the many crimes laid to his charge, and then returned into Judea, after he had been there 3 whole years in this expedition. And now he was kindly received of the nation, because of the good success he had. So when he was at rest from war, he fell into distemper, for he was afflicted with a quartan ague, and supposed that, by exercising himself again in martial affairs, he should get rid of this distemper, but by making such expeditions at unseasonable times, and forcing his body to undergo greater hardships than it was able to bear, he brought himself to his end. He died, therefore, in the midst of his troubles, after he had reigned 27 years. End of Book 1, chapters 3 and 4. Book 1, chapters 5 and 6 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews, by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5. Alexandra reigns 9 years, during which time the Pharisees were the real rulers of the nation. 1. Now Alexander left the kingdom to Alexandra his wife, and depended upon it that the Jews would now very readily submit to her, because she had been very averse to such cruelty as he had treated them with, and had opposed his violation of their laws, and had thereby got the goodwill of the people. Nor was he mistaken as to his expectations, for this woman kept the dominion by the opinion that the people had of her piety, for she chiefly studied the ancient customs of her country, and cast those men out of the government that offended against their holy laws. And as she had 2 sons by Alexander, she made Hyrcanus the elder high priest, on account of his age, as also, besides that, on account of his inactive temper, no way disposing him to disturb the public. But she retained the younger, Aristobulus, with her as a private person, by reason of the warmth of his temper. 2. And now the Pharisees joined themselves to her, to assist her in the government. There are a certain sect of the Jews that appear more religious than others, and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. Lo, Alexander hearkened to them to an extraordinary degree, as being herself a woman of great piety towards God. But these Pharisees artfully insinuated themselves into her favor by little and little, and became themselves the real administrators of the public affairs. They banished and reduced whom they pleased. They bound and loosed men at their pleasure. Footnote: Matthew 16:19, 18:18. Here we have the oldest and most authentic Jewish exposition of binding and loosing, for punishing or absolving men, not for declaring actions lawful or unlawful, as some more modern Jews and Christians vainly pretend. End footnote. And, to say all at once, they had the enjoyment of the royal authority, whilst the expenses and the difficulties of it belonged to Alexandra. She was a sagacious woman in the management of great affairs, and intent always upon gathering soldiers together, so that she increased the army the one half, and procured a great body of foreign troops, till her own nation became not only very powerful at home, but terrible also to foreign potentates, while she governed other people, and the Pharisees governed her. 3. Accordingly, they themselves slew Diogenes, a person of figure, and one that had been a friend to Alexander, and accused him as having assisted the king with his advice, for crucifying the 800 men before mentioned. They also prevailed with Alexandra to put to death the rest of the house who had irritated him against them. Now she was so superstitious as to comply with their desires, and accordingly they slew whom they pleased themselves. But the principal of those that were in danger fled to Aristobulus, who persuaded his mother to spare the men on account of their dignity, but to expel them out of the city, unless she took them to be innocent. So they were suffered to go unpunished, and were dispersed all over the country. But when Alexandra sent out her army to Damascus, under pretense that Ptolemy was always oppressing that city, she got possession of it, nor did it make any considerable resistance. She also prevailed with Tigranes, king of Armenia, who lay with his troops about Ptolemais, and besieged Cleopatra. Footnote: Strabo relates that this Selene Cleopatra was besieged by Tigranes, not in Ptolemais, as here, but after she had left Syria, in Seleucia, a citadel in Mesopotamia, and adds that when he had kept her a while in prison, he put her to death. Dean Eldridge supposes here that Strabo contradicts Josephus, which does not appear to me, for although Josephus says both here and in the Antiquities that Tigranes besieged her now in Ptolemais, and that he took the city, as the Antiquities inform us, yet does he nowhere intimate that he now took the queen herself, so that both the narrations of Strabo and Josephus may still be true notwithstanding. End footnote. By agreements and presents to go away. Accordingly, Tigranes soon arose from the siege, by reason of those domestic tumults which happened upon Lucullus's expedition into Armenia. 4. In the meantime, Alexandra fell sick, and Aristobulus, her younger son, took hold of this opportunity with his domestics, of which he had a great many, who were all of them his friends, on account of the warmth of their youth, and got possession of all the fortresses. He also used the sums of money he found in them to get together a number of mercenary soldiers, and made himself king, and besides this, upon Hyrcanus's complaint to his mother, she compassionated his case, and put Aristobulus's wife and sons under restraint in Antonia, which was a fortress that joined to the north part of the temple. It was, as I have already said, of old called the Citadel, but afterwards got the name of Antonia, when Antony was lord of the East, just as the other cities, Sebaste and Agrippius, had their names changed, and these given them from Sebastus and Agrippa. But Alexandra died before she could punish Aristobulus for his disinheriting his brother, after she had reigned 9 years. Chapter 6. When Hyrcanus, who was Alexander's heir, receded from his claim to the crown, Aristobulus is made king, and afterward the same Hyrcanus, by the means of Antipater, is brought back by Abetus. At last Pompey is made the arbitrator of the dispute between the brothers. 1. Now Hyrcanus was heir to the kingdom, and to him did his mother commit it before she died. But Aristobulus was superior to him in power and magnanimity. And when there was a battle between them, to decide the dispute about the kingdom, near Jericho, the greatest part deserted Hyrcanus, and went over to Aristobulus. But Hyrcanus, with those of his party who stayed with him, fled to Antonia, and got into his power the hostages that might he for his preservation, which were Aristobulus's wife, with her children. But they came to an agreement before things should come to extremities, that Aristobulus should be king, and Hyrcanus should resign that up, but retain all the rest of his dignities, as being the king's brother. Hereupon they were reconciled to each other in the temple, and embraced one another in a very kind manner, while the people stood round about them. They also changed their houses, while Aristobulus went to the royal palace, and Hyrcanus retired to the house of Aristobulus. 2. Now those other people which were at variance with Aristobulus were afraid upon his unexpected obtaining the government, and especially this concerned Antipater, whom Aristobulus hated of old. Footnote: that this Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, was an Idumean, as Josephus affirms here. See the note on Antiquities, B. 14, chapter 15, section 2. It is somewhat probable, as Haperkamp supposes, and partly Spanheim also, that the Latin is here and truest, that Pompey did him Hyrcanus, as he would have done the others from Aristobulus, although his remarkable abstinence from the 2,000 talents that were in the Jewish temple, when he took it a little afterward, will to Greek all which agree he did not take them. End footnote. He was by birth an Idumean, and one of the principal of that nation, on account of his ancestors and riches, and other authority to him belonging. He also persuaded Hyrcanus to fly to Aretas, the king of Arabia, and to lay claim to the kingdom, as also he persuaded Aretas to receive Hyrcanus, and to bring him back to his kingdom. He also cast great reproaches upon Aristobulus, as to his morals, and gave great commendations to Hyrcanus, and exhorted Aretas to receive him, and told him how becoming a filing it would be for him, who ruled so great a kingdom, to afford his assistance to such as are injured, alleging that Hyrcanus was treated unjustly, by being deprived of that dominion which belonged to him by the prerogative of his birth. And when he had predisposed them both to do what he would have them, he took Hyrcanus by night, and ran away from the city, and, continuing his flight with great swiftness, he escaped to the place called Petra, which is the royal seat of the king of Arabia, where he put Hyrcanus into Aretas's hand, and by discoursing much with him, and gaining upon him with many presents, he prevailed with him to give him an army that might restore him to his kingdom. This army consisted of 50,000 footmen and horsemen, against which Aristobulus was not able to make resistance, but was deserted in his first onset, and was driven to Jerusalem. He also had been taken at first by force, if Scaurus, the Roman general, had not come and seasonably interposed himself, and raised the siege. This Scaurus was sent into Syria from Armenia by Pompey the Great, when he fought against Tigranes. So Scaurus came to Damascus, which had been lately taken by Metellus and Lolinus, and caused them to leave the place. And, upon his hearing how the affairs of Judea stood, he made haste thither as to a certain booty. 3. As soon, therefore, as he was come into the country, there came ambassadors from both the brothers, each of them desiring his assistance. But Aristobulus's 300 talents had more weight with him than the justice of the cause, which sum, when Scaurus had received, he sent a herald to Hyrcanus and the Arabians, and threatened them with the resentment of the Romans and of Pompey, unless they would raise the siege. So Aretas was terrified, and retired out of Judea to Philadelphia, as did Scaurus return to Damascus again. Nor was Aristobulus satisfied with escaping out of his brother's hands, but gathered all his forces together, and pursued his enemies, and fought them at a place called Papyron, and slew about 6,000 of them, and, together with them, Antipater's brother Phalion. 4. When Hyrcanus and Antipater were thus deprived of their hopes from the Arabians, they transferred the same to their adversaries, and because Pompey had passed through Syria, and was come to Damascus, they fled to him for assistance, and, without any bribes, they made the same equitable pleas that they had used to Aretas, and besought him to hate the violent behavior of Aristobulus, and to bestow the kingdom on him to whom it justly belonged, both on account of his good character, and on account of his superiority in age. However, neither was Aristobulus wanting to himself in this case, as relying on the bribes that Scaurus had received. He was also there himself, and adorned himself after a manner the most agreeable to royalty that he was able. But he soon thought it beneath him to come in such a servile manner, and could not endure to serve his own ends in a way so much more abject than he was used to. So he departed from Diospolis. 5. At this his behavior Pompey had great indignation. Hyrcanus also and his friends made great intercessions to Pompey. So he took not only from his Roman forces, but many of his Syrian auxiliaries, and marched against Aristobulus. But when he had passed by Pella and Scythopolis, and was come to Caria, where you enter into the country of Judea, when you go up to it through the Mediterranean parts, he heard that Aristobulus was fled to Alexandrium, which is a stronghold fortified with the utmost magnificence, and situated upon a high mountain. And he sent to him, and commanded him to come down. Now his inclination was to try his fortune in a battle, since he was called in such an imperious manner, rather than to comply with that call. However, he saw the multitude were in great fear, and his friends exhorted him to consider what power of the Romans was, and how it was irresistible. So he complied with their advice, and came down to Pompey. And when he had made a long apology for himself, and for the justness of his cause in taking the government, he returned to the fortress. And when his brother invited him again to plead his cause, he came down and spake about the justice of it, and then went away without any hindrance from Pompey. So he was between hope and fear. And when he came down, it was to prevail with Pompey to allow him the government entirely. And when he went up to the citadel, it was that he might not appear to debase himself too low. However, Pompey commanded him to give up his fortified places, and forced him to write to every one of their governors to yield them up, they having had this charge given them, to obey no letters but what were of his own handwriting. Accordingly he did what he was ordered to do, but he had still an indignation at what was done, and retired to Jerusalem, and prepared to fight with Pompey. 6. But Pompey did not give him time to make any preparations for a siege, but followed him at his heels. He was also obliged to make haste in his attempt, by the death of Mithridates, of which he was informed about Jericho. Now here is the most fruitful country of Judea, which bears a vast number of palm trees besides the balsam tree, whose sprouts they cut with sharp stones, and at the incisions they gather the juice, which drops down like tears. So Pompey pitched his camp in that place one night, and then hasted away the next morning to Jerusalem. But Aristobulus was so affrighted at his approach, that he came and met him by way of supplication. He also promised him money, and that he would deliver up both himself and the city into his disposal, and thereby mitigated the anger of Pompey. Yet did not he perform any of the conditions he had agreed to, for Aristobulus's party would not so much as admit Gabinius into the city, who was sent to receive the money that he had promised. End of Book 1, Chapters 5 and 6. Book 1, Chapters 7 and 8 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, Chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7. How Pompey had the city of Jerusalem delivered up to him, but took the temple by force. How he went into the Holy of Holies, as also what were his other exploits in Judea. 1. At this treatment Pompey was very angry, and took Aristobulus into custody. And when he was come to the city, he looked about where he might make his attack, for he saw the walls were so firm that it would be hard to overcome them, and that the valley before the walls was terrible, and that the temple, which was within the valley, was itself encompassed by a very strong wall, insomuch that if the city were taken, that temple would be a second place of refuge for the enemy to retire to. 2. Now as he was long in deliberating about this matter, a sedition arose among the people within the city, Aristobulus's party being willing to fight, and to set their king at liberty, while the party of Hyrcanus were for opening the gates to Pompey, and the dread people wherein occasioned these last to be a very numerous party, when they looked upon the excellent order the Roman soldiers were in. So Aristobulus's party was worsted, and retired into the temple, and cut off the communication between the temple and the city, by breaking down the bridge that joined them together, and prepared to make an opposition to the utmost. But as the others had received the Romans into the city, and had delivered up the palace to him, Pompey sent Piso, one of his great officers, into that palace with an army, who distributed a garrison about the city, because he could not persuade any one of those that had fled to the temple to come to terms of accommodation. He then disposed all things that were round about them so as might favor their attacks, as having Hyrcanus's party very ready to afford them both counsel and assistance. 3. But Pompey himself filled up the ditch that was oil the north side of the temple, and the entire valley also, the army itself being obliged to carry the materials for that purpose. And indeed it was a hard thing to fill up that valley, by reason of its immense depth, especially as the Jews used all the means possible to repel them from their superior situation. Nor had the Romans succeeded in their endeavors, had not Pompey taken notice of the 7th days, on which the Jews abstain from all sorts of work on a religious account, and raised his bank, but restrained his soldiers from fighting on those days. For the Jews only acted defensively on Sabbath days. But as soon as Pompey had filled up the valley, he erected high towers upon the bank, and brought those engines which they had fetched from Tyre near to the wall, and tried to batter it down. And the slingers of stones beat off those that stood above them, and drove them away. But the towers on this side of the city made very great resistance, and were indeed extraordinary, both for largeness and magnificence. 4. Now here it was that, upon the many hardships which the Romans underwent, Pompey could not but admire, not only at the other instances of the Jews' fortitude, but especially that they did not at all intermit their religious services, even when they were encompassed with darts on all sides. For, as if the city were in full peace, their daily sacrifices and purifications, and every branch of their religious worship, was still performed to God with the utmost exactness. Nor indeed when the temple was actually taken, and they were every day slain about the altar, did they leave off the instances of their divine worship that were appointed by their law. For it was in the 3rd month of the siege before the Romans could even with great difficulty overthrow one of the towers, and get into the temple. Now he that first of all ventured to get over the wall was Faustus Cornelius, the son of Sylla. And next after him were 2 centurions, Furius and Fabius. And every one of these was followed by a cohort of his own, who encompassed the Jews on all sides, and slew them, some of them as they were running for shelter to the temple, and others as they, for a while, fought in their own defense. 5. And now did many of the priests, even when they saw their enemies assailing them with swords in their hands, without any disturbance, go on with their divine worship, and were slain while they were offering their drink offerings, and burning their incense, as preferring the duties about their worship to God before their own preservation. The greatest part of them were slain by their own countrymen of the adverse faction, and an innumerable multitude threw themselves down the precipices. Nay, some there were who were so distracted among the insuperable difficulties they were under, that they set fire to the buildings that were near to the wall, and were burnt together with them. Now of the Jews were slain 12,000, but of the Romans very few were slain, but a greater number was wounded. 6. But there was nothing that affected the nation so much, in the calamities that they were then under, as that their holy place, which had been hitherto seen by none, should be laid open to strangers, for Pompey, and those that were about him, went into the temple itself. Footnote: Thus says Tacitus, C.N. Popelna first of all subdued the Jews, and went into their temple, by right of conquest. Nor did he touch any of its riches, as has been observed on the parallel place of the Antiquities, B. 14, chapter 4, section 4, out of Cicero himself. End footnote. Whither it was not lawful for any to enter but the high priest, and saw what was reposited therein, the candlestick with its lamps, and the table, and the pouring vessels, and the censers, all made entirely of gold, as also a great quantity of spices heaped together, with 2,000 talents of sacred money. Yet did not he touch that money, nor anything else that was there reposited, but he commanded the ministers about the temple, the very next day after he had taken it, to cleanse it, and to perform their accustomed sacrifices. Moreover, he made Hyrcanus high priest, as one that not only in other respects had showed great alacrity on his side during the siege, but as he had been the means of hindering the multitude that was in the country from fighting for Aristobulus, which they were otherwise very ready to have done, by which means he acted the part of a good general, and reconciled the people to him more by benevolence than by terror. Now, among the captives, Aristobulus's father-in-law was taken, who was also his uncle. So those that were the most guilty he punished with decalathlon, but rewarded Faustus, and those with him that had fought so bravely, with glorious presents, and laid a tribute upon the country, and upon Jerusalem itself. 7. He also took away from the nation all those cities that they had formerly taken, and that belonged to Celesyria, and made them subject to him, that he was at that time appointed to be the Roman president there, and reduced Judea within its proper bounds. He also rebuilt Gadara. Footnote: the coin of this Gadara, still extant, with its date from this era, is a certain evidence of this its rebuilding by Pompey, as Spanheim here assures us. End footnote. That had been demolished by the Jews, in order to gratify one Demetrius, who was of Gadara, and was one of his own freedmen. He also made other cities free from their dominion, that lay in the midst of the country, such, I mean, as they had not demolished before that time, Hippos and Scythopolis, as also Pella and Samaria and Marissa, and besides these Ashdod and Jamnia and Arethusa. And in like manner dealt he with the maritime cities, Gaza and Joppa and Dora, and that which was anciently called Strato's Tower, but was afterward rebuilt with the most magnificent edifices, and had its name changed to Caesarea by King Herod. All which he restored to their own citizens, and put them under the province of Syria, which province, together with Judea, and the countries as far as Egypt and Euphrates, he committed to Scaurus as their governor, and gave him 2 legions to support him, while he made all the haste he could himself to go through Cilicia, in his way to Rome, having Aristobulus and his children along with him as his captives. They were 2 daughters and 2 sons, the one of which sons, Alexander, ran away as he was going, but the younger, Antigonus, with his sisters, was carried to Rome. Chapter 8. The son of Aristobulus, who ran away from Pompey, makes an expedition against Hyrcanus, but being overcome by Gabinius, he delivers up the fortresses to him. After this, Aristobulus escapes from Rome and gathers an army together. But being beaten by the Romans, he is brought back to Rome, with other things relating to Gabinius, Crassus, and Cassius. 1. In the meantime, Scaurus made an expedition into Arabia, but was stopped by the difficulty of the places about Petra. However, he laid waste the country about Pella, though even there he was under great hardship, for his army was afflicted with famine. In order to supply which want, Hyrcanus afforded him some assistance, and sent him provisions by the means of Antipater, whom also Scaurus sent to Aretas, as one well acquainted with him, to induce him to pay him money to buy his peace. The king of Arabia complied with the proposal, and gave him 300 talents, upon which Scaurus drew his army out of Arabia. Footnote: take the like attestation to the truth of this submission of Aretas, king of Arabia, to Scaurus the Roman general, in the words of Dean Eldridge. Hence, says he, is derived that old and famous denarius belonging to the Aemilian family, represented in Haverkamp's edition, wherein Aretas appears in a posture of supplication, and taking hold of a camel's bridle with his left hand, and with his right hand presenting a branch of the frankincense tree, with this inscription, M. Scaurus ex Sc, and beneath, Rex Aretas. End footnote. 2. But as for Alexander, that son of Aristobulus who ran away from Pompey, in some time he got a considerable band of men together, and lay heavy upon Hyrcanus, and overran Judea, and was likely to overturn him quickly. And indeed he had come to Jerusalem, and had ventured to rebuild its wall that was thrown down by Pompey, had not Gabinius, who was sent as successor to Scaurus into Syria, showed his bravery, as in many other points, so in making an expedition against Alexander, who, as he was afraid that he would attack him, so he got together a large army, composed of 10,000 armed footmen, and 1,500 horsemen. He also built walls about proper places, Alexandrium and Hyrcanium and Machaerus, that lay upon the mountains of Arabia. 3. However, Gabinius sent before him Marcus Antonius, and followed himself with his whole army. But for the select body of soldiers that were about Antipater, and another body of Jews under the command of Malichus and Pytholeus, these joined themselves to those captains that were about Marcus Antonius, and met Alexander, to which body came Oabinius with his main army soon afterward. And as Alexander was not able to sustain the charge of the enemy's forces, now they were joined, he retired. But when he was come near to Jerusalem, he was forced to fight, and lost 6,000 men in the battle, 3,000 of which fell down dead, and 3,000 were taken alive. So he fled with the remainder to Alexandrium. Now when Gabinius was come to Alexandrium, because he found a great many there encamped, he tried, by promising them pardon for their former offenses, to induce them to come over to him before it came to a fight. But when they would hearken to no terms of accommodation, he slew a great number of them, and shut up a great number of them in the citadel. Now Marcus Antonius, their leader, signalized himself in this battle, who, as he always showed great courage, so did he never show it so much as now. But Gabinius, leaving forces to take the citadel, went away himself, and settled the cities that had not been demolished, and rebuilt those that had been destroyed. Accordingly, upon his injunctions, the following cities were restored: Scythopolis, and Samaria, and Anthedon, and Apollonia, and Jamnia, and Raphia, and Mariassa, and Adorius, and Gamala, and Ashdod, and many others, while a great number of men readily ran to each of them, and became their inhabitants. 5. When Gabinius had taken care of these cities, he returned to Alexandrium, and pressed on the siege. So when Alexander despaired of ever obtaining the government, he sent ambassadors to him, and prayed him to forgive what he had offended him in, and gave up to him the remaining fortresses, Hyrcanium and Machaerus, as he put Alexandrium into his hands afterwards, all which Gabinius demolished, at the persuasion of Alexander's mother, that they might not be receptacles of men in a second war. She was now there in order to mollify Gabinius, out of her concern for her relations that were captives at Rome, which were her husband and her other children. After this, Gabinius brought Hyrcanus to Jerusalem, and committed the care of the temple to him, but ordained the other political government to be by an aristocracy. He also parted the whole nation into 5 conventions, assigning one portion to Jerusalem, another to Gadara, then another should belong to Amathus, a fourth to Jericho, and to the 5th division was allotted Sepphoris, a city of Galilee. So the people were glad to be thus freed from monarchical government, and were governed for the future by all aristocracy. 6. Yet did Aristobulus afford another foundation for new disturbances. He fled away from Rome, and got together again many of the Jews that were desirous of a change, such as he had borne in affection to him of old. And when he had taken Alexandrium in the first place, he attempted to build a wall about it. But as soon as Gabinius had sent an army against him under Siscuria, and Antonius, and Servilius, he was aware of it, and retreated to Machaerus. And as for the unprofitable multitude, he dismissed them, and only marched on with those that were armed, being to the number of 8,000, among whom was Pytholeus, who had been the lieutenant at Jerusalem, but deserted to Aristobulus with 1,000 of his men. So the Romans followed him, and when it came to a battle, Aristobulus's party for a long time fought courageously, but at length they were overborne by the Romans, and of them 5,000 fell down dead, and about 2,000 fled to a certain little hill. But the 1,000 that remained with Aristobulus brake through the Roman army, and marched together to Machaerus. And when the king had lodged the first night upon its ruins, he was in hopes of raising another army, if the war would but cease a while. Accordingly he fortified that stronghold, though it was done after a poor manner. But the Romans falling upon him, he resisted, even beyond his abilities, for 2 days, and then was taken, and brought a prisoner to Gabinius, with Antigonus his son, who had fled away together with him from Rome. And from Gabinius he was carried to Rome again. Wherefore the Senate put him under confinement, but returned his children back to Judea, because Gabinius informed them by letters that he had promised Aristobulus's mother to do so, for her delivering the fortresses up to him. 7. But now, as Gabinius was marching to the war against the Parthians, he was hindered by Ptolemy, whom, upon his return from Euphrates, he brought back into Egypt, making use of Hyrcanus and Antipater to provide everything that was necessary for the expedition. for Antipater furnished him with money, and weapons, and corn, and auxiliaries. He also prevailed with the Jews that were there, and guarded the avenues at Pelusium, to let them pass. But now, upon Gabinius's absence, the other part of Syria was in motion, and Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, brought the Jews to revolt again. Accordingly, he got together a very great army, and set about killing all the Romans that were in the country. Hereupon Gabinius was afraid, for he was come back already out of Egypt, and obliged to come back quickly by these tumults, and sent Antipater, who prevailed with some of the revolters to be quiet. However, 30,000 still continued with Alexander, who was himself eager to fight also. Accordingly, Gabinius went out to fight, when the Jews met him, and as the battle was fought near Mount Tabor, 10,000 of them were slain, and the rest of the multitude dispersed themselves, and fled away. So Gabinius came to Jerusalem, and settled the government as Antipater would have it. Thence he marched, and fought and beat the Nabateans. As for Mithridates and Orsanes, who fled out of Parthin, he sent them away privately, but gave it out among the soldiers that they had run away. 8. In the meantime, Crassus came as successor to Gabinius in Syria. He took away all the rest of the gold belonging to the temple of Jerusalem, in order to furnish himself for his expedition against the Parthians. He also took away the 2,000 talents which Pompey had not touched. But when he had passed over Euphrates, he perished himself, and his army with him, concerning which affairs this is not a proper time to speak more largely. 9. But now Cassius, after Crassus, put a stop to the Parthians, who were marching in order to enter Syria. Cassius had fled into that province, and when he had taken possession of the same, he made a hasty march into Judea, and, upon his taking Tarichae, he carried 30,000 Jews into slavery. He also slew Pitholaus, who had supported the seditious followers of Aristobulus, and it was Antipater who advised him to do so. Now this Antipater married a wife of an eminent family among the Arabisus, whose name was Cypros, and had 4 sons born to him by her, Phasaelus and Herod, who was afterwards king, and, besides these, Joseph and Pheroras, and he had a daughter whose name was Salome. Now as he made himself friends among the men of power everywhere, by the kind offices he did them, and the hospitable manner that he treated them, so did he contract the greatest friendship with the king of Arabia, by marrying his relation, insomuch that when he made war with Aristobulus, he sent and entrusted his children with him. So when Cassius had forced Alexander to come to terms and to be quiet, he returned to Euphrates, in order to prevent the Parthians from repassing it, concerning which matter we shall speak elsewhere. Footnote. This citation is now wanting. End footnote. End of Book 1, Chapters 7 and 8. Book 1, Chapters 9 and 10 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews, by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, Chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9. Aristobulus is taken off by Pompey's friends, as is his son Alexander by Scipio. Antipater cultivates a friendship with Caesar, after Pompey's death. He also performs great actions in that war, wherein he assisted Mithridates. 1. Now, upon the flight of Pompey and of the Senate beyond the Ionian Sea, Caesar got Rome and the empire under his power, and released Aristobulus from his bonds. He also committed 2 legions to him, and sent him in haste into Syria, as hoping that by his means he should easily conquer that country, and the parts adjoining to Judea. But envy prevented any effect of Aristobulus's alacrity, and the hopes of Caesar, for he was taken off by poison given him by those of Pompey's party, and, for a long while, he had not so much as a burial vouchsafed him in his own country, but his dead body lay above ground, preserved in honey, until it was sent to the Jews by Antony, in order to be buried in the royal sepulchres. 2. His son Alexander also was beheaded by Scipio at Antioch, and that by the command of Pompey, and upon an accusation laid against him before his tribunal, for the mischiefs he had done to the Romans. But Ptolemy, the son of Menneus, who was then ruler of Chalcis, under Libanus, took his brethren to him by sending his son Philippio for them to Ascalon, who took Antigonus, as well as his sisters, away from Aristobulus's wife, and brought them to his father, and falling in love with the youngest daughter, he married her, and was afterwards slain by his father on her account. For Ptolemy himself, after he had slain his son, married her, whose name was Alexandra, on account of which marriage he took the greater care of her brother and sister. 3. Now, after Pompey was dead, Antipater changed sides, and cultivated a friendship with Caesar. And since Mithridates of Pergamus, with the forces he led against Egypt, was excluded from the avenues about Pelusium, and was forced to stay at Asielon, he persuaded the Arabians, among whom he had lived, to assist him, and came himself to him, at the head of 3,000 armed men. He also encouraged the men of power in Syria to come to his assistance, as also to the inhabitants of Libanus, Ptolemy and Jamblichus, and another Ptolemy. By which means the cities of that country came readily into this war, insomuch that Mithridates ventured now, in dependence upon the additional strength that he had gotten by Antipater, to march forward to Pelusium, and when they refused him a passage through it, he besieged the city, in the attack of which place Antipater principally signalized himself, for he brought down that part of the wall which was over against him, and leaped first of all into the city, with the men that were about him. 4. Thus was Pelusium taken. But still, as they were marching on, those Egyptian Jews that inhabited the country called the country of Onias stopped them. Then did Antipater not only persuade them not to stop them, but to afford provisions for their army, on which account even the people about Memphis could not fight against them, but of their own accord joined Mithridates. Whereupon he went round about Delta, and fought the rest of the Egyptians at a place called the Jews' camp. Nay, when he was in danger in the battle with all his right wing, Antipater wheeled about, and came along the bank of the river to him, for he had beaten those that opposed him as he led the left wing. After which success he fell upon those that pursued Mithridates, and slew a great many of them, and pursued the remainder so far that he took their camp, while he lost no more than 80 of his own men, as Mithridates lost, during the pursuit that was made after him, about 800. He was also himself saved unexpectedly, and became an unreproachable witness to Caesar of the great actions of Antipater. 5. Whereupon Caesar encouraged Antipater to undertake other hazardous enterprises for him, and that by giving him great commendations and hopes of reward. In all which enterprises he readily exposed himself to many dangers, and became a most courageous warrior, and had many wounds almost all over his body, as demonstrations of his valor. And when Caesar had settled the affairs of Egypt, and was returning into Syria again, he gave him the privilege of a Roman citizen, and freedom from taxes, and rendered him an object of admiration by the honors and marks of friendship he bestowed upon him. On this account it was that he also confirmed Hyrcanus in the high priesthood. Chapter 10. Caesar makes Antipater procurator of Judea, as does Antipater appoint Phasaelus to be governor of Jerusalem, and Herod governor of Galilee, who, in some time, was called to answer for himself before the Sanhedrin, where he is acquitted. Sextus Caesar is treacherously killed by Bassus, and is succeeded by Marcus. 1. About this time it was that Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, came to Caesar, and became, in a surprising manner, the occasion of Antipater's further advancement. For whereas he ought to have lamented that his father appeared to have been poisoned on account of his quarrels with Pompey, and to have complained of Scipio's barbarity towards his brother, and not to mix any invidious passion when he was suing for mercy, besides those things, he came before Caesar, and accused Hyrcanus and Antipater, how they had driven him and his brethren entirely out of their native country, and had acted in a great many instances unjustly and extravagantly with relation to their nation. And that as to the assistance they had sent him into Egypt, it was not done out of good will to him, but out of the fear they were in from former quarrels, and in order to gain pardon for their friendship to his enemy Pompey. 2. Hereupon Antipater threw away his garments, and showed the multitude of the wounds he had, and said that, as to his good will to Caesar, he had no occasion to say a word, because his body cried aloud, though he said nothing himself, that he wondered at Antigonus's boldness, while he was himself no other than the son of an enemy to the Romans, and of a fugitive, and had it by inheritance from his father to be fond of innovations and seditions, that he should undertake to accuse other men before the Roman governor, and endeavor to gain some advantages to himself, when he sought to be contented that he was suffered to live. For that the reason of his desire of governing public affairs was not so much because he was in want of it, but because, if he could once obtain the same, he might stir up a sedition among the Jews, and use what he should gain from the Romans to the disservice of those that gave it him. 3. When Caesar heard this, he declared Hyrcanus to be the most worthy of the high priesthood, and gave leave to Antipater to choose what authority he pleased. But he left the determination of such dignity to him that bestowed the dignity upon him. So he was constituted procurator of all Judea, and obtained leave, moreover, to rebuild those walls of his country that had been thrown down. Footnote: What is here noted by Hudson and Spanheim, that this grant of leave to rebuild the walls of the cities of Judea was made by Julius Caesar, not as here to Antipater, but to Hyrcanus, has hardly an appearance of a contradiction, Antipater being now perhaps considered only as Hyrcanus's deputy and minister, although he afterwards made him a cipher of Hyrcanus, and, under great decency of behavior to him, took the real authority to himself. These honorary grants Caesar sent orders to have engraved in the Capitol, that they might stand there as indications of his own justice, and of the virtue of Antipater. 4. But as soon as Antipater had conducted Caesar out of Syria, he returned to Judea, and the first thing he did was to rebuild that wall of his own country, Jerusalem, which Pompey had overthrown, and then to go over the country, and to quiet the tumults that were therein, where he partly threatened, and partly advised every one, and told them that in case they would submit to Hyrcanus, they would live happily and peaceably, and enjoy what they possessed, and that with universal peace and quietness, but that in case they hearkened to such as had some frigid hopes by raising new troubles to get themselves some gain, they should then find him to be their lord, instead of their procurator, and find Hyrcanus to be a tyrant instead of a king, and both the Romans and Caesar to be their enemies, instead of rulers, for that they would not suffer him to be removed from the government, whom they had made their governor. And, at the same time that he said this, he settled the affairs of the country by himself, because he saw that Hyrcanus was inactive, and not fit to manage the affairs of the kingdom. So he constituted his eldest son, Phasaelus, governor of Jerusalem, and of the parts about it. He also sent his next son, Herod, who was very young, or 25 years of age. Many writers of the Roman history give an account of this murder of Sextus Caesar, and of the war of Apamia upon that occasion. They are cited in D. Aldrich's note. With equal authority into Galilee. 5. Now Herod was an active man, and soon found proper materials for his active spirit to work upon. And therefore he found that Hezekias, the head of the robbers, ran over the neighboring parts of Syria with a great band of men. He caught him and slew him, and many more of the robbers with him, which exploit was chiefly grateful to the Syrians, insomuch that hymns were sung in Herod's commendation, both in the villages and in the cities, as having procured their quietness, and having preserved what they possessed to them, on which occasion he became acquainted with Sextus Caesar, a kinsman of the great Caesar, and president of Syria. A just emulation of his glorious actions excited Phasaelus also to imitate him. Accordingly, he procured the goodwill of the inhabitants of Jerusalem by his own management of the city affairs, and did not abuse his power in any disagreeable manner, whence it came to pass that the nation paid Antipater the respects that were due only to a king, and the honors they all yielded him were equal to the honors due to an absolute lord. Yet did he not abate any part of that goodwill or fidelity which he owed to Hyrcanus. However, he found it impossible to escape envy in such his prosperity. 6. However, he found it impossible to escape envy in such his prosperity, for the glory of these young men affected even Hyrcanus himself already privately, though he said nothing of it to anybody. But what he principally was grieved at was the great actions of Herod, and that so many messengers came one before another, and informed him of the great reputation he got in all his undertakings. There were also many people in the royal palace itself who inflamed his envy at him, those, I mean, who were obstructed in their designs by the prudence either of the young men or of Antipater. These men said that by committing the public affairs to the management of Antipater and of his sons, he sat down with nothing but the bare name of a king, without any of its authority, and they asked him how long he would so far mistake himself, as to breed up kings against his own interest. For that they did not now conceal a government of affairs any longer, but were plainly lords of the nation, and had thrust him out of his authority. That this was the case when Herod slew so many men without his giving any command to do it, either by word of mouth, or by his letter, or this in contradiction to the law of the Jews, who therefore, in case he be not a king, but a private man, still ought to come to his trial, and answer it to him, and to the laws of his country, which do not permit any one to be killed till he hath been condemned in judgment. 7. Now Hyrcanus was, by degrees, inflamed with these discourses, and at length could bear no longer, but he summoned Herod to take his trial. Accordingly, by his father's advice, and as soon as the affairs of Galilee would give him leave, he came up to Jerusalem, when he had first placed garrisons in Galilee. However, he came with a sufficient body of soldiers, so many indeed that he might not appear to have with him an army able to overthrow Hyrcanus's government, nor yet so few as to expose him to the insults of those that envied him. However, Sextus Caesar was in fear for the young man, lest he should be taken by his enemies, and brought to punishment. So he sent some to denounce expressly to Hyrcanus, that he should acquit Herod of the capital charge against him, who acquitted him accordingly, as being otherwise inclined also so to do, for he loved Herod. 8. But Herod, supposing that he had escaped punishment without the consent of the king, retired to Sextus, to Damascus, and got everything ready, in order not to obey him if he should summon him again. Whereupon those that were evil disposed irritated Hyrcanus, and told him that Herod was gone away in anger, and was prepared to make war upon him. And as the king believed what they said, he knew not what to do, since he saw his antagonist was stronger than he was himself. And now, since Herod was made general of Coelesyria and Samaria by Sextus Caesar, he was formidable, not only from the good will which the nation bore him, but by the power he himself had, insomuch that Hyrcanus fell into the utmost degree of terror, and expected he would presently march against him with his army. 9. Nor was he mistaken in the conjecture he made. Out of the anger he bare him for his threatening him with the accusation in a public court, and led it to Jerusalem, in order to throw Hyrcanus down from his kingdom. And this he had soon done, unless his father and brother had gone out together and broken the force of his fury, and this by exhorting him to carry his revenge no further than to threatening and affrighting, but to spare the king, under whom he had been advanced to such a degree of power, and that he ought not to be so much provoked at his being tried, as to forget to be thankful that he was acquitted, nor so long to think upon what was of a melancholy nature, as to be ungrateful for his deliverance. And if we ought to reckon that God is the arbitrator of success in war, an unjust cause is of more disadvantage than an army can be of advantage, and that therefore he ought not to be entirely confident of success in a case where he is to fight against his king, his supporter, and one that had often been his benefactor, and that had never been severe to him, any otherwise than as he had hearkened to evil counselors, and this no further than by bringing a shadow of injustice upon him. So Herod was prevailed upon by these arguments, and supposed what he had already done was sufficient for his future hopes, and that he had enough shown his power to the nation. 10. In the meantime, there was a disturbance among the Romans about Apamia, and a civil war occasioned by the treacherous slaughter of Sextus Caesar by Caecilius Bassus, which he perpetrated out of his goodwill to Pompey. He also took the authority over his forces, but as the rest of Caesar's commanders attacked Bassus with their whole army, in order to punish him for the murder of Caesar, Antipater also sent them assistance by his sons, both on account of him that was murdered, and on account of that Caesar who was still alive, both of which were their friends. And as this war grew to be of considerable length, Marcus came out of Italy as successor to Sextus. End of Book 1, chapters 9 and 10.